instead of in the chat window. So we will let you know when that happens.
Yeah, you want to kick it off?
Let's do it.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, first of all, thank you guys so much for coming today. We hope you're as enthusiastic about mushrooms and mushroom hunting as we are. Just as a quick, can you pull up?
Yep.
Cool. Great.
Go.
Very good. So my name is Tara Geiger, and this is my husband, Andrew Drzezinski.
Nice to meet everybody.
Very nice to meet everybody over Zoom. We are actually talking to you from Wyoming. We're DC natives. Pull up the little slide for that.
Yeah, that's after the topics.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Oh, that's all right. Yeah, oh, sorry about that. We're DC natives. Been there for about 20 years, and then I came to Wyoming to. I went back to grad school as Drew came with me, but we have been foraging for about 2015.
5-6 years now, I would say.
What got us into foraging, Drew?
So we started off, I've always had a super interest in mushrooms. I was browsing the Reddit, mycology, and mushroom identification forums for a really long time, sort of in the background. But what really kicked us off was in 2015, we took a permaculture certification course. And one of the activities that we did as a part of that certification was to go out and find a bunch of mushrooms. You'll have to excuse our dog.
We have a puppy who's very loud.
Very loud puppy who wants our attention right now. So we took this course in permaculture, and really what that gave us is what we hope to give you guys in this course. It gave us the enough knowledge and enough know-how to be able to go out and pick things out of the woods and start to be able to identify them. And really, for me at least, what it gave me was permission to go do that, right? Like, you can look at mushrooms in the woods and be like, oh, cool, but they're poisonous, right? Can I touch them? Can I mess around with them? Can I bring them home? Is that okay for the environment? Am I ruining things? So we'll go into all of that in more detail, but really the permaculture class in 2015 kicked it off. And from that point forward, it was just a matter of a lot of learning online, a lot of forums, and a lot of going out and exploring in the woods. So hopefully we can show you how to get started in this hobby. The rabbit hole goes deep on this one, but hopefully we can give you a start so you know how to get into the hobby. This isn't going to be a complete, here's everything we know, but it'll be pretty through. So.
Yeah, and in the time we've started, we have found many, many different species. In fact, most of the photos you'll see here are different things that we've found around, different types of mushrooms we found around DC. So it's kind of exciting.
I think our current count, we're up to 37 different species between the two of us that we have tried.
Yes.
So not exactly in the amateur class anymore, I think. We're getting towards being actual experts in this stuff. So what else? Oh, we also, for those of you who joined a little bit early and saw Josh on the line as well, Josh was one of our co-founders at the DUG Network, the DC Urban Gardeners Network. So if you guys are familiar with that, or you get that newsletter from Josh Singer, which maybe even was how you found out about this class, we helped found that as well. And when we come back to DC at the end of the year, we might get re-involved again. We haven't discussed that very much, but
yeah.
is that good?
Yeah, let's move on to what we're going to talk about today.
All right, today's topics. Starting, of course, with a welcome and introduction, which I think we already sort of did. And then we're going to jump into a little bit of a disclaimer right now about the risks of mushroom hunting. And then we'll go to the fungal facts. What is fungus? What is mycelium? What is a mushroom? What are these different components of mushrooms? Because the more you understand the organism itself, the more you can find in the woods, because you sort of know where to look. How and where to start collecting, how to get things like spore prints together. We'll go through all of that stuff. A long list of choice edibles that we think are easy, good beginner species for people to start learning. We'll talk a little bit about proper cooking techniques, the legality of harvesting mushrooms, especially in the DC metro area. And then we're going to give you a bunch of resources on how to continue learning, because this is the start of a process, not the end of it. You will not come out of this knowing everything you need to know to go out and pick 37 different species of mushrooms and just go with it. So just real quick before we jump forward, a note on the risks of mushroom hunting. When we have given this class in the past, we have asked people to sign a disclaimer Here, we just like your virtual head nod that you understand that this is a risky activity, but it's a risky activity the way rock climbing is a risky activity, which is that there is very solid rules that you can follow that make this much, much less risky than it would be if you just threw a rope over the edge of a cliff and started jumping, right? So that's what we're going to try to get to here.
Sounds good.
All right. All right, I'll leave it to Tara to jump into about the fungus body itself.
All right, yep, a little bit about fungi. And many of you may already know this, but just in case not, I wanted to talk about it briefly. I think a lot of times we see a mushroom and we think that that is the organism. And it's very helpful to note, both in terms of knowing how to hunt for them and knowing that that is not just the organism, and also in terms of wanting to get rid of mushrooms. I get a lot of people asking me how to get rid of a mushroom. It's helpful to know that the organism under that mushroom is much, much wider, much, much broader. So what a mushroom is a physical manifestation, like a flower, of a different type of organism. The actual organism is comprised of something called mycelium. We have a picture that that we actually took of it. It's kind of feathery, sort of, how would you describe it?
Yeah, it's like little, they're called hyphae, little filaments.
Well, yeah, the hyphae is almost like a plant roots growing off of the broader mycelium, and they can go for miles. So you may see one mushroom, but the reality is that below ground, it can be much, much larger. They reproduce by spores, so they initially start somewhere and they are fixed, but the hyphae is what can move and can go out. It's starting from a center place. This is actually why you see fairy rings sometimes with mushrooms, where you see them popping up in a circle. The organism's in the middle and it's spread out like a circle, and you see the manifestations popping up around it. Yeah, as I say here, it's when you see the mushroom, it's like fruit. It's just a piece of that. So it's very hard if people say, well, go pick that mushroom, or I've heard people ask if they should pour bleach or boiling water on a mushroom to try to get rid of it, particularly something called a stinkhorn, sort of an unpleasant mushroom. That's just not going to cut it. You would need to go either industrial, or I would make the case that you should just leave it alone, because they play a really, really important role in the environment, which kind of brings me to the next question. Go ahead.
One more quick piece on that. One of the things, one of my pet peeves in the mushroom hunting community, there's a lot of people who don't understand that the mycelium is the real organism and the mushroom is the fruit, the way that an apple tree is a real organism and the apple is a fruit. And so picking too many of these mushrooms, there's this thing called pick shaming, where they'll say, oh, why did you pick all of these mushrooms when you don't even know what it is? You don't even know if it's toxic or edible. I encourage you to pick as many mushrooms as you want. By the time you see the mushroom, they have already released billions of spores into the environment, and you're not hurting the actual organism itself by picking the fruits, the same way you're not hurting an apple tree by picking an apple. So I really want everyone to keep that in mind. It is not harmful to the environment. It is not harmful to the mycelium to pick the mushrooms as fruits. So you have my permission to go out there and grab whatever you want out of the woods, provided it's legal and you're not on private property, right?
Very nice. Good point, Drew. So before I go forward on the next slide, I'm kind of curious to know something. And this is sort of, for those of you who don't mind, if you have an answer, that you can just put it in the chat box. But I'm curious if you guys are familiar with the sort of role that mushrooms play in our ecosystem, or their primary role. What do they do? Does anybody have any ideas? Let me give it a minute. Very good. I see a decomposers popping up. Huge one. I like Lou. Anybody a decomposers big? No. Okay. Any other ideas besides that? I might surprise you with some facts. Yeah, I don't think I include food on my slide. The next slide. Yes, facilitators to trees and other plants. Very good. Any other ideas? Okay, I'm going to move on and not hold this up. You guys know a lot. Wow. Thank you. Okay, so the very first thing that does come to mind, and it's critically important, is they play a really, really major role in decomposition and in nutrient cycling through our systems and into our soils. So they actually are very important because they break down different materials in nature that other microorganisms can't. So cellulose and lignin are a little bit tougher, so they break them down into simpler forms that other organisms can come along and eat. So they're really, really important for that. They also do, this is kind of a growing body of interest scientifically, but we now know, and back when I was growing up in the 80s, we never talked about this, like decomposition was it. But now we know that they play a really important role in partnership with many, many plants. So they often are exchanging different, they're exchanging, say, carbon and getting nitrogen from these plants. So there's an exchange between mushrooms and plants that's very, very important. Something else that we don't think about, and another reason to keep them around rather than trying to rid yourself of mushrooms or fungi unless you have a specific reason to do so, is that they ensure soil health by creating aggregate soil. So it kind of helps to hold our soil together. That's a critical function. Without those hyphae or those little fingers that we talk about, soil would be much looser. So that's very important. And then something that's become really popular over the last maybe 10 years or so is this, they call it the wood wide web. So mushrooms are not only communicating and having these exchanges with plants, they're also facilitating through this huge web of mycelium and hyphae, communications and exchange of nutrients between plants, which is very, very interesting. I'd encourage you to Google it. I could talk about it all day.
I think in the chat there we have April saying Suzanne Simmons. I think she was actually the one who came up with the Wood Wide Web terminology.
I think she was. That's awesome, April. Thank you.
Excellent. We appreciate that, April.
Yep, very cool. Another thing that I always find really interesting is there's some evidence to show that they aid in a plant's defense. So one of the ways that they do that is you could say they are priming the immune system of these little plants when some types of fungi actually will penetrate the cells of plant roots. And when they do that, it stimulates an immune response. So it's priming that plant before other invaders can come, and it makes it a healthier plant. So that's very important. And then just briefly to highlight, there's a downside too. So fungi are also responsible for many, many different types of plant diseases, which is why you might want to use an antifungal or try to get rid of them. Yeah. Oh, thanks.
One second.
There we go.
So we don't use that. All right.
Oh, okay. And some quick fun fungi facts. We love puns. You're going to notice that in our presentation. There are only about 100,000 species discovered so far, but we have estimated that there's well over 1 million yet to discover, which is pretty cool. I also wanted to mention that the largest living organism on Earth is a type of honey fungus in Oregon, almost 2.5 miles wide. And in fact, in Rock Creek Park, we have a ton of honey fungus. You'll see them after rain. They're beautiful, and edible. I thought it was helpful to note that when we talk about different kingdoms, fungi and animals are much more closely related to each other than plants and fungi because they don't walk like us. We don't think of fungi like that. But for example, both humans and fungi breathe in oxygen and put out carbon dioxide. So that's kind of interesting. A lot of fungi that we have traditionally thought belong together in groupings and in the same genus are actually being reanalyzed right now using DNA techniques. And so they are, instead of defining them by their taxonomy, we're now going through DNA and seeing that they need to be reclassified. That's a big undertaking. And then the number one mushroom hunting, mushroom hunting is the number one hobby for finding dead bodies. It is not. It is not. We made that up. It lands better when you have an audience.
Yeah, real quick. Okay, before I jump on to the next slide here, which is about the inherent dangers, I want to poll you guys. Let's see if this poll works here. All right, so if you could take 1 second just to take a guess here at how many people have died from mushroom poisoning in the United States in the last 50 years. All right. Got almost everybody in here. Let's give it another second.
Interesting.
Okay, let's share the results here. So, a lot of people have some up in the 5,000. Yeah, we've got one of them in the 5,000 range, one in the 1,000 range, a couple over 100, a couple over 50, and a couple fewer than 10. The correct answer, if you're wondering, is 52. There's been exactly 52 deaths in the last, 30 years. From mushroom poisonings reported in the United States. So while it's possible, I'm pretty sure more people have died on 495 in the last 10 years than that. So in terms of risk management, that's what we're talking about here. So mushrooms are not to be truffled with. We've got lots of puns in here. I apologize in advance. Foraging for any wild edible, including mushrooms, has inherent dangers. If you get something wrong, bad things can happen. Death still occurs in 20 to 30% of cases of accidental poisoning. Most of the accidental poisoning is from people who lived in another country and became very familiar with a very specific kind of mushroom there, and then use the same characteristics here, but wind up accidentally finding one of the deadly amanitas, either of the destroying angel or the fly of garlic, or there's a handful that are not good, and we'll go over specifics on which ones later. But yeah, if you get to the hospital on time, a lot of times they can help you, but a lot of times these are mushrooms that the toxins are bad enough that they can destroy your liver or kidneys, and you will need a transplant. So, and it only takes one. So one of the things we talk about a lot in the mushroom world is that the dose is the poison. And that means that you can actually, and we'll get into this a little bit, but you can actually taste and nibble any mushroom, no matter how toxic it is, and then spit it out again, and you're okay. But there are mushrooms where if you consume one whole mushroom of that type, it's enough to kill you. So you do have to be careful, but these are calculated risks. The only thing you really have to do is make sure 100% sure every time that you know the positive identification of the mushroom that you are about to ingest, right? And what does that mean? That means you personally have to know the identification. This is not like some guy somewhere in the woods said, oh yeah, those are beefsteak mushrooms. My grandma used to eat those all the time. We have heard that in the woods from people who were incorrect about their identification. Overconfidence, thinking you're better than you are, thinking that that you have come far enough that you can definitely tell the difference between a Cortinarius and a Blewit without taking a spore print, is huge. So don't be overconfident. Always doubt yourself a little bit. Make sure you're 100% sure. Inexperience obviously is a factor, but unfamiliar territory, I would say, is the bigger factor. So make sure that if you are used to mushroom hunting in one place and go somewhere else, learn their mushrooms. They may have similar characteristics to the ones you are familiar with eating, and they are not okay. So yeah, when in doubt, throw it out. That's going to be our big takeaway from the entire thing. When in doubt, throw it out. If you don't know what it is, do not eat it.
Very good. Nope, go on. Well, you have a note about Nicholas Evans, which I think is the author of The Horse Whisperer. It's an interesting story that might be worth sharing.
Yeah, so Nicholas Evans, the guy who wrote The Horse Whisperer, was a very, very experienced mushroom hunter, had been hunting mushrooms for 35, 40 years, really knew his stuff well, and became overconfident. And one time went out and found a bunch of what he thought were wood blewits. Wood blewits are an advanced species. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But it's for this reason that he thought they were wood blewits. They, in fact, were Cortinarius, and he wound up putting his entire family in the hospital, and I think all of them had to get kidney transplants. They survived, but they needed like 4 kidney transplants within a couple of days. It was not an easy, yeah.
I think his wife and his brother-in-law. Yeah. So it's pretty scary.
Yeah, so that overconfidence can happen at any time during the cycle. We could potentially get overconfident.
We have with that exact mushroom, but that's perhaps for later.
Yeah, we'll talk to you a little bit about that when we talk about spore prints. But yeah, the critical part is making sure you're 100% sure every time, because it only takes one. They say, there's a famous saying in the mushroom hunting community that there are old mushroom hunters and there are bold mushroom hunters, but there are no old, bold mushroom hunters. You must be cautious. You must be careful. And don't listen to grandpa or grandma. Like, make sure you know 100% what it is before consuming. Okay, disclaimers out of the way. Let's move on, shall we? So where do you actually get started? You want me to jump into the...
You love talking about gear, you go for it.
All right, so you need basically two things. You need some equipment, and you need to be out in the woods in order to find mushrooms. Those are the two critical components. In terms of equipment, it's really nice to have a knife, especially as you get further into mushroom hunting where you're not just taking individual samples in order to try to identify. If you're taking down 10 to 15 pounds of chanterelles or morels or something like that, cutting the bases off just saves so much time in cleaning.
It saves time in cleaning. It saves time actually as you're cutting. And the mycelium of that organism will be okay, but a lot of times when you're pulling those up, you're gonna damage some of that's close to the surface, and I prefer not to go out and damage the organism that I'm harvesting.
The caveat on that is if you are trying to identify a mushroom, you want to get the whole thing. You want to get all the way down into the base for sure. But once you know what you're doing, and once you're out there and you just, find 15 pounds of chicken in the woods, you don't want to be ripping it off the tree. You want a knife to be able to cut it off. Basket or a mesh bag is helpful. You can help spread spores as you walk around. So if you're in a place where everything is all above board and you find some mushrooms and you want to help spread them around, a basket or a mesh bag is helpful. We also use brown paper bags a lot, partially because a lot of times I like to throw stuff in my backpack and not worry about carrying a basket. Partly it's to separate species. Like if we, find 2 or 3 species that we really know really well and we know we're going to like, and then one that we're kind of confident on or we want to go take back for an ID, segregating those out so they don't get mixed into our supply of known good mushrooms is nice. So brown paper bags are good for that. Field guide is really nice. We'll go through some field guides later on. It's helpful to be able to flip through and just get a general idea of whether something that you come across in the woods might be edible for further study back home, because then it's worth taking, right? It's worth taking in mass instead of just the one sample. Map and GPS on phone. This is important both so you don't get lost, but also so you can find your spots again. Some of the spots that we have, you think you're going to memorize them, and then you're like, wait, which woods were we in when we found that one maitake on that one tree? And it was next to a sidewalk. But if you got the GPS and you're taking pictures, that's good. Bug spray, critical for ticks, especially around the Maryland area. Lyme disease is for real. That's actually probably more likely to make you sick than finding a toxic mushroom, as long as you follow all our rules. Water, camera, hat, long pants, compass, snacks, whistle, macro lens, all nice to haves. Just for general, this is just being prepared to be in the woods for a long period of time, more than specific to mushroom hunting. Yeah. Important note on the bottom there, if you're hunting alone, so if you're going out into the woods, this is just general woodsiness, but if you're going out by yourself and expect to be home at 6 p.m., let someone know where you're going and where to come back from. We have a question on what's your opinion about using gloves, like gardening gloves, are those necessary? I've never used them. I don't think they're necessary. You can touch any mushroom and not get poison from it. It does not go through your skin. So if you don't like being out in the dirt and digging through leaf litter and stuff, you're more than welcome to wear gloves, but I don't find them to be necessary.
I have never used gloves.
Yeah, no. Good question though. Thank you.
And in fact, sometimes you'll be surprised by the texture. There's a lot of mushrooms are like sticky. Feeling it is actually part of the identification process. We don't focus too much on that, but it's been helpful.
Yeah, certainly. Flammulina velopides, which is the velvet foot mushroom, has a velvety base on it and a very sticky cap. And those two are important identifying characteristics. So you might not know those if you're wearing gloves.
Very good. All right. So getting into the woods. All right, Drew. So one of our first tips here we have is to train your eye. Just slow it down and look for all sorts of fungus all around you. And for me, that's that's like the place to start. One thing we did, and I'm going to touch back on this in a minute with the slide. When we first started, this was, I would call it almost not a mistake, but we started getting interested by having a guide and then looking for specific species using that guide, or maybe seeing a mushroom and pulling the guide out. But that's not really an effective way of doing it. So in contrast, what would you recommend?
Right, so it's entirely possible that you could find one of 50,000 species in the DC metro region. So if you're wandering around picking up every single mushroom and trying to look it up and figure out what that mushroom is, that's a very difficult pathway to take. It's much easier to know a handful of mushrooms and then go out into the woods and be looking for those specific mushrooms. Now that said, one of the things you have to get used to is what I like to call mushroom country. So a lot of times when we're looking for mushrooms, we will be walking really fast through relatively dry, rocky area, and then one of us will notice something. There will be a humidity change, or there will be something that's just a little leaf litter somewhere in the ground that looks weird. And those are the places where we really slow down and look and see whether there's fungus there. So,
and the way you kind of do that, and I know this sounds like I know it, but it truly is to just start taking walks in the woods, start looking at the ground. At this point, I could, like, a monkey could come swinging at me and hit me and I wouldn't even see it coming, because honestly, I mostly look at the ground when I'm mushroom hunting. And it is just a very slow process, literally and physically. We used to go hiking for maybe 5 to 10 mile hikes on Saturdays, up in Catoctin area. And after we started mushroom hunting, we would go 1 to 2 miles over the same amount of time. So you really do need to start to slow down, and don't try to label anything. Don't necessarily bring a book at first. Just start looking for any kind of thing that you think is a fungus. Just train the eye. Yeah,
and one of the helpful things for me, at least, is that if you go out into the woods right now and you are not normally in the woods, if you're, normally have your video games as your hobby and you're just going to jump into mushroom hunting here, if you're not out in the woods regularly, you kind of don't know what normal looks like. And a lot of what we're looking for when we're looking for fungus is something that looks off, something that looks not normal. Just like either the way a leaf is sitting seems like it couldn't have fallen that way.
A leaf's askew. You're going to see that a lot with fungi, like it's kind of popping up. Color flashes, I think we put on there is a huge way. You just catch it, it starts popping.
Yep. And if you're walking around Rock Creek, you will certainly find every diaper that's out there, because your eyes will just go to that little flash of something that's not normal for being on the floor of the woods. And that's a critical factor for being able to find large amounts of mushrooms.
As you're doing that, you are going to, I promise you will start to, as Drew alluded to or mentioned, start feeling it. It's bizarre to talk about. You will start feeling that you are in the right spot. And it's not just sensory in terms of humidity. That's a big one after it rains, but then just general humidity. There's little pockets of microclimates. You will start smelling mushrooms. It's peculiar, but your brain's going to start tying what you're seeing to feelings around. I promise it'll happen. Seasonality, as we mentioned, is also really important. Early spring. I mean, things are, especially in the DC metro area, things are popping up almost the entire year, right? But yeah, late summer and early fall, we have found is like major prime time where you are. Know what habitat they like, we had mentioned. And especially that's helpful to know trees. A lot of them are decomposing trees or growing with trees. We have a lot of oaks in the DC area, right? So oaks and mushroom and fungi get along really, really well.
Everything loves oak.
But then here's a sneaky secret. Look for dead standing trees, because those are, you're almost certain to find something around a dead standing tree. It may not be edible, but you're going to find something. We also wanted to note to never ever underestimate a mushroom. They will undoubtedly, without question, always surprise you. They're just sneaky. They're hiding behind stuff. I don't know how to describe it, but
there's a mushroom called lion's mane that we'll go into later, but its habitat, it likes to be either 20 feet up in a tree, which is a surprising thing to look up. You've been searching the forest floor, and you look up and you see this big white puffball coming off a tree. And then they also like hiding in stumps. So you could, you peer into this little stump hole, and there's a mushroom in there. There's a big white puffball thing. Yeah. They like hiding from you. It's a weird.
Another thing to know, if you find one definitely keep looking. Oftentimes, because that organism is so spread out underground, you are most likely going to continue to find more around you. Not always, but more around you often.
Yeah, if the conditions are right for one mushroom, it's more likely the conditions are right for a bigger flush. So definitely, if you find something, take your time in that area, really scour it
Or
deeply.
we don't have it on this slide, but sometimes mushrooms can pop up so fast it would blow your mind. So if you find something that you like in a particular area and then you get like a rain, come back a day or two later, you would be surprised by how many more you might find in that same spot. Now I have here, and we did touch on it, guides are most helpful after you have experience spotting them. So like when Drew and I first started, and like this I would not do, this is something I would change a lot. We went out for a permaculture class. We found, they said, go find a mushroom, pull out your ID book and ID this. And that's like a fun exercise, but that is so not the best way to use an ID book, or if you want to go hunt edible mushrooms. We are going to have a recommendation that's worked really well for us. Should I just tell them this? Oh, okay, all right. And you're gonna get this out of this presentation. The best thing you can possibly do is find, say, a handful, and we'll give them to you for your area, a handful of edible, delicious mushrooms that are very hard to mistake for anything that could possibly hurt you. So extremely easily identified, not gonna hurt you. Start looking for those, like have that into your mind before you go into the woods. And then use those guidebooks to just confirm what they are after the fact. Would you agree? Yeah, that for me is one of the best ways, if you want to be foraging for mushrooms, that you should proceed. Don't just go out and try to identify everything. Like we said, there's over 100,000 species out there.
Yeah, and that's like the unknown species. Like the known species bridge that too. There's way more species than that.
Oh, so, yeah. Yep. So, and then browse forums, that was your point, Drew?
Right, so this part is critical for me, at least, in terms of my development as a mushroom hunter. I browse the forums a lot, and we'll give you links later on to, there's a couple of Facebook groups that are really good, and there's a couple of Reddit groups that are pretty good. The critical thing is that you may only once a year or twice a year run into something like chicken of the woods. Chicken of the woods is very distinctive. It's very easy to identify, but if you've only ever seen it once before, it's going to be much more difficult for you to be like, is that chicken of the woods? But if you've seen on these forums people posting, hey, is this chicken, is this chicken, is this chicken? And then some people will say, yes, that is, or this isn't. It really starts to help you distinguish, because there's just, you know, even in the best seasons, you may see these things 3 or 4 times. So if you have hundreds of pictures you can go through from other people with positive, good identifications on them, it really gives you a leg up to be like, you know, I'm not sure, but I think this is maitake. Let's take this one home and really look into it and see whether it is that or not. And then post to those same forums, and you can get a positive ID from people. So
perfect.
Super helpful.
All right. Now, you've gone into the woods. You found something. Now what? That was true.
Absolutely. So now what? So I know we just said don't go out there and find, and try to identify the things that you find, but it is a good exercise, and it's a good exercise for a couple of reasons. One is that I'm going to give you permission right now to touch any mushroom in the woods, to smell any mushrooms in the woods, to pick it up, to examine it.
He does actually put it in his mouth and chew. He will chew it.
I will
not, but he's very brave.
It's called a taste and spit test. It is totally safe. All of the good mushroom hunters that I'm aware of on all of the forums are doing taste and spit. There are certain mushrooms that it's better with, certain that aren't. But then this pick out key features piece for me is, as you start to develop your eye, what will happen is you can start to, there's these broad classifications that you can do that will sort of quickly get you in the right area for what kind of mushroom you're looking at. And these features, we're going to go through them quickly. I'm not going to really delve in depth, but I want you to see just the various kinds of features that we could be looking for. And then I'll show you at the end why that matters. So first, this is a generic picture of a mushroom that's up here. It's got this ring around it. It's got this vulva down below. It's got this, the various pieces on the top, little scabbing and stuff. So let's just go through these one at a time. So first, the cap, right? You can have a bunch of different cap shapes. And these shapes can change over time. In fact, almost all of these characteristics, with the exception of a few, can change over time. So it's important to be looking at, if you have a big cluster of mushrooms, look at an old one, look at a medium one, and look at a baby one to see whether there are any of these features present in one stage that might not be present in another stage. So you can see from here that there are, down in the bottom right corner, this is probably the most critical thing, is that some mushrooms have pores, some mushrooms have gills, some mushrooms have teeth, and some mushrooms have these wrinkles that we call false gills. These are huge dividing characteristics to divide the mushrooms into these big groups. And they matter, right? So you can have two different mushrooms, for example, a chanterelle and a jack-o'-lantern mushroom might superficially look similar, but one very definitely has false gills and the other very definitely has real gills. And so that becomes a distinguishing characteristic between those two. All of the features that you see here, how crowded the gills are to each other, how distant they are, how they connect to the stem, the size and shape of the cap, these are all things that can potentially be used to distinguish between different kinds of mushrooms. The stem, it may have a ring, it may not have a ring. There may be a thing called a veil. You can see the picture in the bottom right corner, or bottom left corner, where one of them has a veil where it covers and the other does not. This is the same exact kind of mushroom in two different stages of its life. So in the first one, that veil is still there. In the second one, that veil has ripped off. So it's important to get multiple different, yeah, absolutely.
Well, actually a really good, something that kind of exemplifies that would be the white button mushroom, right?
Yeah.
Like between, I'm not sure how many of you know, but a white button mushroom it's like the same species as a portobello, right?
Yeah, so
just a baby.
Yeah, so white buttons, creminis, and portobellos are all the same species. They're bisporous, Agaricus bisporus. It's all the same species. There's a sort of a pale colored one that winds up being the white button mushrooms, and then there's this darker colored variety that is the creminis and portobellos. But creminis and portobellos are the same mushroom harvested at two different stages of their growth. That's why portobellos actually cost more, is because they've taken longer to grow in the warehouse that they grow them in. All right.
Lou says fascinating. Thank you, Lou.
Thank you, Lou. All right, so here's the stem, and you can see a little bit here why I said that when you're identifying a mushroom, it's important to grab the whole thing to pull it out of the base instead of cutting it. As you can see here, the equal club-shaped bulbous, those pieces at the bottom with the cup with the vulva, can be identifying characteristics. There are some aminatas, for example, where the difference between having a vulva and not having a vulva is the difference between a deadly poisonous version of a mushroom and one that you could potentially eat. So, you know, that's all more advanced stuff, but it's good to know all the different pieces that you could take a look at. Okay, and then you don't need to know all of these different things, but you need to know how to take pictures of mushrooms in a way that is going to be good for a positive ID later on. So if you don't want to take this sample, or you just want to get an ID on this later on, if you just take a top-down shot, it is not good enough. You need to get some of these other characteristics too, including habitat, including location. So here we'll go into a couple other characteristics. You can see here, this is sort of the broader characteristics, zooming out from the individual mushroom. Are they in a fairy ring? Is it in a forest? Is it in a field? Is it growing off of a cow patty? Is it, these things are all critical also. So your location physically, your geography, your seasonality. So, you know, if you have something that pops up that looks like Chicken in the Woods, but it's March in DC, that's probably not Chicken in the Woods. There's probably something else going on there. That's not the season for it. Although that's changing a little bit with climate change now. The other thing you can do is a spore print. Spore print is getting the color of the spores of a particular mushroom. You can see one in the bottom right corner here. In terms of spores, to take a spore print, it's relatively straightforward actually, and you can see one we've done here on black paper. We started off using construction paper and different kinds of colored paper for spore prints. It turns out that hands down for us, the best thing you can do it on is aluminum foil, the shiny side of the aluminum foil. And all you do is you take the cap, you cut the stem off, you put the cap face down on the aluminum foil, you cover it with something. A lot of times we'll use like a Tupperware container or a glass, depending on the size of it, and just leave it overnight. You can leave it for 4 or 5 hours to get a light spore print, or for much longer to get a dark spore print. Do you
Oh, to add in here? Oh,
got a wood bluet story?
Well, we do have a wood bluet story, although Drew's much better at telling stories than I am. But we do have a story here that is critically relevant to this. So we basically, a number of years ago, we were starting to feel more confident and had been hunting for a while. We went out and we saw, we'll show you, I think we have a picture of it later on, but this type of mushroom that is absolutely gorgeous. It's called a wood bluet. It's like purple and blue and absolutely gorgeous. So it's a choice edible, but so we thought we positively ID'd it. We were really confident. Yeah, this is it. So confident that we went home, cooked it, and ate it. And then I don't know why, but it was at that point in our night that we thought we might want to Google and see if there's any kind of poisonous look-alike. So this was kind of early on. There is a false sense of confidence you can get if you start successfully mushroom hunting. As we're Googling, we noticed that there's something called a Cortinarius that is almost a near perfect look-alike for the wood bluet. It's deadly poisonous, and it tends to grow around the same area and time of the year as the wood bluet. This was quite possibly one of the most terrifying moments it was the most terrifying moment of my life as a mushroom hunter, because I'd already ingested it. And I mean, it was grueling to know whether or not I should follow the own steps I'm going to give you guys later for safety or not. But because the problem with the wood bluet is that it can sit for you for a while. You're not going to necessarily know that it's doing some damage to you internally until it's too late. So the way that we resolve this, we did not follow my own good advice at that time, but what we did do, the main character way to tell the difference between these two species is the spore print. Super easy to do. A Cortinarius has a very brown, rusty spore print. And if you want to get very detailed and you like science, you can actually do it on like a slide and look under the microscope at individual spores, because the shape of the spores matter too. But didn't for us. We just needed to know, was the spore print whitish pink, like a wood bluet, or was it brown like a Cortinarius? And so I'll tell you, those like 5 or 6 hours while we were waiting for it to drop its spores were probably some of the most nerve-wracking of my whole life. So you can make mistakes, and that spore print, that's why a spore print is helpful.
And that's why we stress so much being 100% sure. 95% sure is not enough for your own peace of mind afterwards, And then both of us actually wound up feeling a little bit sick to our stomachs, which really scared us. But then it turns out that we hadn't researched wood bluets.
Oh, yeah.
You have to cook them for 20 to 25 minutes, which we did not realize at the time. And so the sickness we were feeling was just from undercooking what was a very edible and actually delicious mushroom.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're 95 to 98% sure and you're like, oh yeah, I'm close. No, you're not close enough. 100% or throw it out. That's it. Those are your options. Because that moment of fear and panic of, oh my God, did I just poison myself with mushrooms the way my parents said I was going to?
Yeah, some of our parents are very nervous about it.
Yeah.
But fortunately for everybody, beyond just like spore prints and your guidebooks, there's a really good resource.
This is the other piece, is that when you get to that 98% sure, and you're like, I know this, but I need some other confirmation from somewhere else. Ask online. There are a bunch of different groups. The Facebook group Mushroom ID, I think, is my favorite of all the groups. There's also one on Reddit. I think a lot of the same people are on both of them. For me, the Facebook group is quick. You get accurate IDs from literally the top people in the field, the Alan Rockefellers, and there's some serious heavy hitter mycologists that browse these forums very regularly. But when you ask for an ID, you have to show them all of the pieces that we were talking about, because you don't know exactly which piece is going to be the distinguishing characteristic between two things. In the wood bluets versus Cortinarius, it's the spore print. For some other species, it's whether a vulva is present or not. For some other species, it's whether it's pure white in the inside or whether there's the little hints of brown. So without knowing exactly what the distinguishing characteristics are, you have to post all of them. So you post a picture of the cap, of the stipe, a cross section, including some of these you can see on here have been bluing. A lot of mushrooms would do that, especially the boletes will have some blue staining to them. and then the habitat and the location and date that you found them. That will give you a positive ID. People will come back and say, okay, that's one of these, that's a Gallerina, that's a this, that's a that, and then you can look into it further from there to confirm the ID. It's always nice when it comes back and they agree with you, although it's not always the case. Yes.
By type, do you mean stem? Like what commonly we would think of as stem?
Yes, yes. Yeah, it's on the picture there. It's the, yeah, stipe is the stem. Yeah,
pointing it
absolutely.
out in case for those who don't like to read. All right. All right. So which ones can we eat? So let's get into ones that you're actually going to be able to hunt for. And we, like I said, I don't like to brag, but I took all of these pictures here, so they're pretty cool. I found all of these.
All right. So the first thing about eating mushrooms from the woods, from my point of view, is don't eat gross stuff from the woods. You can see here on the right, we have two different pictures of cauliflower mushrooms. We found these on the same day, actually. They were blooming everywhere. This is part of the, you know, when you find one, keep looking in that area. We found a whole hillside full of these. You can see the one on the top is bright. The fronds are popping out. They're really, it looks nice. There's some bugs in there, but there's almost always some bugs involved in your mushrooms. Bugs like eating mushrooms. And then the one below it is just kind of looks gross, right? Like one of the things early on in the hobby, there's a tendency when you find something like a chicken of the woods to just grab all of it because, oh my God, you found this chicken of the woods, right? But if it's not something you would grab out of a bin at Whole Foods, don't grab it. I mean, you can still have gross stuff, even if they're edible species, right?
They can still be disgusting.
Right, they can still be disgusting. They can be bug-ridden. They can have all these problems. They could just have so many leaves embedded in them that it's not going to be worth your time to clean them out.
So it's very true because they're decomposers. A lot of times what you're going to find is that the fungus itself has encompassed either an insect or different pieces of whatever it's eating, be that wood or leaves or some leaf litter. So that does happen.
Yeah. So that's sort of one level of edibility is, would you buy this at the grocery store, right? That's the first level. The second level is that there's a lot of mushrooms out there that are inedible for one reason or another. Either they're super bitter, or they're super woody, or they have just a really weird spongy texture to them. They're inedible, but they're not toxic. And this actually makes up a lot of the different mushrooms. In fact, a lot of people are getting into medicinal mushrooms and having cordyceps or turkey tail or reishi ganoderma, those kind of species in their coffee. They don't taste good. They're not good. They may have medicinal value, but they're not good tasting. You wouldn't want to sit down to a meal of these things. So there's a different level of inedibility there, which is just that it's not a good tasting thing, even though it's not toxic.
But I do take comfort in knowing that the majority of the mushrooms out there are not toxic. They just will give you stomachache. So keep that in mind, because I think in our culture in the US, we have a phobia about mushrooms. The majority of them are not going to kill you, even if you eat them.
Yeah, and that's actually part of this third category, the toxic category. The toxicity ranges from you're going to have a bad night in the bathroom all the way up through you're going to need a kidney transplant tomorrow or death, right? So there's a wide range, even within the toxic mushrooms, there's a wide range of what toxic means. There's also certain species, chicken of the woods is one of them. We'll touch on that later. Chicken of the woods, a certain percentage of people, it just doesn't sit with them well. There's, you know, some people have speculated that it's ones growing off certain kinds of trees. There's not a lot of science behind it, but when you're eating a mushroom for the first time, even if it's in the edible category, you could potentially have some kind of allergic reaction to it. You could potentially, so for new species, even if they're edible, they're totally non-toxic, you might have a little bit of weird reaction to them. Oh, the other one was if you don't cook them correctly, if you don't cook them for long enough, certain ones will give you a bad reaction. Mostly, we're looking at, you know, an evening in the bathroom that you probably will regret. But yeah, so there's levels within the toxicity as well. Other factors that affect edibility: age, moisture content. Sometimes they just dry out and they would have been good, but they're just totally dried. Sometimes you can rehydrate them, sometimes you can't. So yeah, lots of factors there. All right. Yep.
All right. Sorry about that. All right. So let's talk about some actual species that in the DC metro area you can find. And for anybody tuning in from Wyoming. Some of these are also relevant for Wyoming as well. All of these, we've picked these. These are some of our favorites. They're basically like what we started on. They're great beginner mushrooms. So what you want to do is kind of look at these and start to note what these look like. We also picked them because they're, for the most part, they're not going to have toxic lookalikes. The ones that do, we've marked them, and I think those lookalikes are pretty discernible from the actual mushroom. Pretty easy. So did we have a poll that we wanted to do before we?
Yes, let's do a quick poll here. Okay. All right. So what we want to do here is collect just of these. Besides this class, how many of these have you ever heard of? And how many of these have you ever eaten? Some of them are more common than others, but we're just curious about who has what experience with some of these wild mushrooms. All right, I'll give you guys a couple minutes there. Also, when we made this list, we tried to have a top 10 list, and then counted last night and realized we actually had 11. Rather than deleting one, we just went with 11. 12. Couple more seconds here. Let people get through the second question.
Oh my gosh, people are familiar with a lot of these.
Yeah.
Very good.
So
yeah, I'll share.
Pause the polling here and share back out. That's cool. Okay, so everybody has heard of oyster mushrooms, right? These are a really common one. They're delicious, and you can find them in the woods quite easily, which is nice. They're also very easy to cultivate. Just a little plug, next Thursday night, not this week, but next week, I'm doing another one of these courses on how to grow mushrooms yourself. Which I got into much more recently than foraging. But if you're interested in growing any of these, feel free to tune in next week. Good, yeah. So
and morels. I'm very impressed.
Yeah, everybody knows morels. Yeah, that's a very classic. So with some of these like morels, what happens is because everyone knows about morels, you get a lot of false information flying around grandma's old wives' tales and how to. You're supposed to soak them in salt water and all this craziness that it's hard to kill because everyone likes morels and everyone likes killing morel hunting.
But it is very interesting that a number of people haven't heard of a couple of them, like the cauliflower mushroom, that's the polypore. So we're going to introduce you to a couple of new ones.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Good. All the others are up there.
Yeah, very cool.
At least somebody has heard of all these. And then in terms of eating, okay. So almost everyone's had oysters, lots of morels.
No one's had a wood ear.
No
you guys,
one's had
these
a
are
wood ear.
everywhere near you. I can't wait for you to see
Super easy to find wood ears. Giant puffballs. When you find them, you know for sure you found one. Chicken in the woods. A couple people have had those. Maitakes, morels. Excellent. Very cool. Thank you guys for participating there. Let's jump into it.
All right. Let's take a look at the first one here. I'm going to read like verbatim here just to but just to give you guys a little description. This is pretty common. Chicken of the woods. I don't want to be cliche, but it does actually taste a lot like chicken.
It tastes like chicken.
This is one where you're gonna the main identifier here is this huge pop of orange in the middle of the woods, and you will start to see it. It's almost always growing above the ground, so it's gonna be coming out of a tree. It's a polypore, so you can see on that bottom photo, it's got pores. It doesn't have normal gills, so that's a big giveaway. And this is one of our very first ones we ever found, and we made a mistake of getting so excited in finding it that we just cut it out and took it home and cooked it, and it was like chewy, kind of woody. Well, what had happened is we found a really old one. So you'll know, like that middle picture there was the best one we ever found. It's meaty, it's tender, it's delicious. The older ones, don't even waste your time. You feel happy you found it, but don't waste your time. The only one that it could sort of vaguely resemble is something called a jack-o'-lantern, which is one of the few other like similarly shaped mushrooms out where you are, and also bright orange. Jack-o'-lanterns, interestingly enough, glow in the dark. Interesting fact on that particular fungus. But You can easily discern the difference if you just try to Google between those two.
Yeah, and the main difference there is the difference between pores and gills. So as long as you know that fact, jack-o'-lanterns can't fool you.
Yeah.
As long as you know that, when you see that bright flash of orange and it's a bunch of mushrooms with gills, it's jack-o'-lanterns probably. And if it's pores, then it's probably chicken of the woods. There are two different types of chicken of the woods. They're both laetoporous, and one has a yellowish underside and the other has a white underside. They're both chicken. They're both delicious. Just a quick note as we go through these, you'll notice that we put the Latin names or the scientific binomial names next to a lot of these. As you get into more advanced species, there is less of a connection between the common names and the scientific names. And so certain species don't have a common name. There's only, Schizophyllum commune is only called that. I don't know of any common name for it at all. It's kind of a weird mushroom. But just as a note, as you get into this more and more, you'll see more and more of those binomial names.
Good point, Drew.
Maitake, hen of the woods. So maitakes are, I think, one of my favorite mushrooms to pull out of the woods. They're absolutely delicious, amazing in soups and all kinds of different applications. You can see the one we found here. We actually found this growing out of one of the cross logs that was redirecting water off of the path that we were in up near Catoctin, which is very cool. They grow on wood. This is a late summer and fall mushroom. So this is when we talk about that fall is a really good time in DC to be mushroom hunting. It's because of these guys. It's because of the chicken of the woods, the maitakes, black staining polypores, a handful of other ones. This one is another one that has pores underneath. And you can see it's got all these little individual fronds. These are a little bit hard to clean at times. But yeah, grows in clusters at the base of oaks and other kinds of trees. And this is one that will come back year after year after year. So once you find a spot with good maitake, mark it down, come back later,
don't
keep
tell
checking
anybody.
Your spot, tell no one.
If you're not already familiar with this, the #1 rule of mushroom hunting is we don't talk about mushroom hunting.
Fight Club style.
Another one that I think many of you are really familiar with, and this is one of my favorites. We actually know, we kind of jokingly call it the Valley of the Chanterelles in Rock Creek Park. So I think around July each year,
yeah,
there's a spot that just comes alive with these things. Chanterelles are definitely a choice edible. They're so good and very, very easy to recognize once you understand the gills on those. How would you describe?
So the gills are false gills. So I think the two critical things are, one is they look more like wrinkles in the skin than anything else. The polypores are usually flat and you can see the little holes. These ones, you can't really see the holes where the spores are coming out and it looks wrinkled. It's that middle picture on the bottom there.
And then also it won't come away from the stem. It actually just continues down the stem. Yeah. And so the one that I know I have mostly confused it with would be that jack-o'-lantern, which is also that bright orange. But the gills are a dead giveaway, and once you've positively ID'd a chanterelle, and they're all over Rock Creek Park, you'll know them moving forward.
Yeah, and this is another one that has a handful of species that are all known as chanterelles. They're all equally edible, and they are all equally the same characteristics define them. But the colors change. So there are more yellow ones. There are red chanterelles. There are black trumpets, technically, I think, are a kind of chanterelle. So there's a range of colors, but you get used to, over time, you'll get used to the size and the shape and the sort of frilliness of the edge of the margins of the cap. And then those gills are a dead giveaway every time.
Yep, slugs love these things. They always beat us to the chanterelle.
Yeah, that's true. Oyster mushrooms. All right, so pretty much everybody here has had an oyster mushroom. This is another one where there's 10 or 15 different species. There's ones down in Florida that are pink oysters. They come out pink, very cool. There's golden oysters.
Blue oysters.
There's blue oysters, gray oysters. There's a handful of, now a black pearl king oyster that they have just recently come out with. So,
but these oysters, then that particular log we found just walking through off trail Rock Creek Park one day. Which is kind of cool. They're just growing there.
Yeah, the only thing that looks remotely like these is a mushroom called angel wings, which is not a toxic mushroom. They're not great, but they're not toxic. So you really have no problem. The identifying characteristic for me is that there's an anise smell. There's kind of a licorice smell to them, and the gills. There are gills. It's not a polypore or anything. The gills run all the way down the stem, and the stems are like almost non-existent. It looks like the cap kind of just connects directly.
Lou has a question. Lou says, what do they mean? What did he mean? They just came out with.
Yeah, no, good question. This is part of my mushroom growing course for next week, is that there have been a lot of people who have been doing experiments with oyster mushrooms for a long time, and they have just released a new hybrid strain called Black Pearl King Oyster that grows somewhere between a king oyster, which are the big ones that you eat the stem of, and then these guys. So it's somewhere halfway between. It's a cultivated strain. So it's not something you would find in the woods necessarily, but but it's possible that the spores from that will get out into the woods and then start growing wild. So we'll see what happens over time. I know most people are throwing their giant spent blocks out into the woods. So we'll see what happens next.
Most people, as though everybody's just got giant.
Most people who are growing mushrooms. Sorry.
Fair enough.
Qualify that.
All right, here's the one that we talked about that you're going to start seeing this everywhere, all over Rock Creek. Really, you're going to see this shortly after a rain. These are used a lot in Asian cooking, and I think they use it medicinally as well. Lots of names. I call it wood ear. If you Google that, you'll see it. It's like very distinct. It's jelly-like. It's very easy to pick off. You'll see it on logs like this. And it is fantastic in different types of stir fries. It's a very mild fungus, and I don't know of anything. Yeah, there's nothing actually looking at this that is a poisonous lookalike at all. If you see this, it's definitely edible. They can be very big or kind of small. Yeah, anything to add on these, but start looking on logs, especially after rain. You're going to see these all over the place.
Yeah, I would guess to add to this, there are brown jelly funguses that look sort of like this, but they kind of tend to be clumpier. I think we have a picture of one later I'll point out. These, and then there are brown cup funguses that sort of look like this. The cup funguses will crumble immediately. These are much firmer in texture.
Cup fungus is going to be growing. I wish we had some pictures to show you. They actually grow like out of the ground typically too, off of dead wood. Yeah. These you'll typically see growing on a log, like that off the ground. And then if it crumbles or something, that's not quite right. This should hold together. Should be very good for a stir fry. And then usually in Asian stores, what you'll find is like dehydrated wood ears, but we like to eat them fresh. There's no, but you do want to cook them, but they don't need to be dehydrated.
Mel's happy.
Nice, awesome. Nice job, Mel.
Yeah, there's used a lot in Asian cooking. I will say, just as a note, I don't know all the details on this, but apparently, if you're on blood thinners, these have a chemical in them that increase the blood thinning, or it thins your blood more. So you don't want to eat 6 pounds of these, but you wouldn't want to eat 6 pounds of these anyway. So.
That's true. You don't like chow down on these as you might with a chanterelle.
Very much a textural element to dishes.
Yeah. All right.
Giant puffballs, and when I say giant, I mean giant. I wear a size 14 men's shoe. That is my shoe next to that mushroom. That means that's about the size of a volleyball. These things get huge. Some of them are smaller. Some of them have a little bit more texture on the top, but these are very big. The only thing that you could confuse this with is an unbirthed amanita that's still in its vulva. The scary thing about that is that unbirthed amanita that's in that little vulva package, even though it's small, if you think that's an early puffball and you don't cut it in half to check, they're deadly poisonous. They could potentially be deadly poisonous. So you can see on the right-hand side there that what you want is pure white. If it's yellowing a little bit, that's okay, but it shouldn't have any distinct lines in it like that bottom one does. If it starts to yellow like it's yellow, then it will give you an upset stomach if you eat it. So you really want to get it when it's pure white, when it's really fresh like that.
And also a note on the puffballs, they can both yellow, but they can also start to get black inside. If you open, it's common sense, but if you open it up and it's black, don't eat that.
Yeah, and what happens is that white flesh actually contains the immature spores, and as they mature, this will turn into basically a big sack of spores that will release billions and billions of spores into the atmosphere.
Which is very cool if you flick.
Yeah.
Okay, lion's mane. This is one of our absolute favorites. We were talking earlier on the right, you can see that log. That's the very first lion's mane we ever found, and it's kind of a toothed mushroom, which is fun. I'll talk about that in a sec. But yeah, we kind of popped our head into a tree that was laying on the ground, and that is what was growing deep inside. We went back to it, I think, 3 years in a row and harvested this one and cut it out. It is a really unique and awesome mushroom. Also very harvestable and growable at home. So Drew in our kitchen likes to grow lion's mane. It tastes, interestingly enough, it can taste a lot like crab. So people compare it to that, and the texture can be a lot like crab. But it's one of the rare, like, not rare, but you don't see them as much. It's a toothed mushroom, so it doesn't really have. It's not got pores. It's not got gills. It's literally got something like teeth. And kind of below that, on the bottom left, is another example. I think this is called a bear tooth, but it's another example of a toothed mushroom. Sometimes they look like palms, volleyball palms. Really hard to mistake these guys. Like you're probably pretty safe if you find something like this eating it, and it is delicious. But there is something called a coral fungus. It's not coral fungi are not poisonous either, but not as delicious. Sometimes you could mistake it for a coral fungus. I think we have a picture later on to show what that looks like. But
yeah. And there's slightly different flavors between the different varieties. So this is actually, I think the two pictures here. One is Hericium coralates, and the other is Hericium americanum. The americanum, which is also known as bear's head, is the bottom left one, and it tastes a little bit more like crab to me, and can be used as a crab substitute in recipes. The other one tastes more like a mushroom to me. So subtle differences there, but if you're in this ballpark, these are all edible and delicious.
So good. All right, cauliflower mushrooms.
Cauliflower mushrooms. The cauliflower mushrooms are a little bit more rare, but we have found fields of them in Maryland.
If they're growing, you're gonna see tons of them.
If they're there, they are everywhere. So you catch that one good day out somewhere near Catoctin Mountain or something, and you can find a ton of these things. They're delicious. They look like, I think the best explanation I've heard is it looks like a bowl of, or a colander full of egg noodles that you've turned upside down and sat on the ground. It kind of has that noodly kind of vibe to it. They are a pain in the butt to clean, but they are delicious. They are excellent. And this is one for sure you want to get the freshest ones you can. They go south pretty quickly, and you probably want to eat them the same day if you can.
Oh, Berkeley's polypore. All right. I'm sure that you guys have seen these, like just walking by trees or your neighbors' yards. These are very, very meaty. They come in all sorts of different sizes, from very small. I always like to try to find them when they're pretty young and still fresh, but then they definitely can go past their prime as well. That picture of me in the corner down there is like, it's a little bit old at that point. It's almost always at the base of trees. So yeah, again, like look for anomalies when you're walking in the woods. And I always like to go off trail. I don't want to encourage anybody to get lost, but you see the best mushrooms when you're off trail. But this was a picture taken in Rock Creek Park. These are totally edible. You just get a knife, you can carve off chunks of it. You don't need to take the whole thing because they're very, very wet and very, very heavy. Yeah, they do kind of resemble, they could resemble that maitake, aka hen of the woods, a little bit because of the curvature in there. But for the most part, or another type of polypore. So these are polypores. They have little pores, not gills on the bottom of them. One good way to recognize these ones is a sort of ring. You're going to see usually types of rings. The coloration of the mushroom itself can vary, but you'll see noticeable rings. Anything else to add about Berkeley's?
Yes, these guys get huge. If you see a mushroom out in the woods that's 3-4 feet across and it's this huge thing, it's probably a Berkeley's.
Yeah,
I think that's pretty highly likely.
For the most part, something that's nice to know about polypores is you almost can't go wrong if you do see a polypore mushroom. I mean,
polypore growing off of wood.
Yeah,
you almost can't go wrong.
Like you won't. It may not be delicious, or it may be past its prime, but you are almost certainly not going to make yourself. You're not going to kill yourself eating a polypore. All right.
Flat-stinging polypores. So this made the list because I find them to be delicious if you cook them correctly. When they're out in the woods, they look like the bottom right picture. They look bright white. They look sort of like those Berkeley polypores that we had from before. They look sort of like maitake, although generally they're a little bit bigger. You will know immediately upon harvest, 10 minutes later, if you look back in your bag, you will see all of this black lining around the outside. They actually do turn black. The critical thing in cooking these for me is to cut across the grain so that you're breaking those long fibers up. They can get really woody. If you just threw these in a pan and cooked these, they would taste really woody. But if you chop them up so that you're cutting the long fibers into pieces, then they turn delicious. Oh, yeah. Younger is better on almost all mushrooms. This one in particular, if you can find it young, or if you can take the younger bits of it. Or sometimes what we'll even do, and this is actually true of all the polypores, as they get woodier with age. And so sometimes if you find a big specimen, you can take maybe the outer 2 inches of a big frond instead of taking the whole thing. And those outer couple inches will tend to be younger growth. It'll tend to be a little bit softer.
All right, and I think this is our last kind of common one you can find, and you love talking about this one, so I'm gonna let you talk about it.
So morchellas. So these are the morels. These are probably one of the most famous mushrooms. If you only hunt for one kind of mushroom in the woods, it's most likely that what you're hunting for is morels. These are an early spring mushroom. We've certainly found them in Maryland. We found way more out here in Wyoming. Part of that is because one of the triggers for pinning is forest fire. So if you go to a place where there was a forest fire in the previous year, and there are maps you can look up where forest fires have been, you're much more likely to find these morels popping up. It's one of their triggers for pinning. They're in our area, or sorry, in your area, in the DC metro area, it's generally an April type of mushroom. There's an earlier one that comes up that's a little bit yellower, and a later one that comes up that's black. And you can tell always what will happen is they look like this. They look like these funky sort of brain-looking things. And if you cut them open vertically, then they are completely hollow on the inside. That's the critical determining factor between morels and what are known as false morels. If there's anything else I want to talk about on this one. No. Okay, so let's talk about false morels for a minute. This is another one of my big pet peeves, is that somehow along the lines, there is this shift where people who were morel hunting were either finding morels or they were finding these what are called gyromitras. And gyromitras were for a long time thought to just be, they just classified all of them as false morels, and they said those ones are poisonous. That couldn't be farther from the truth. That's like saying that everything is a false chanterelle, right? False morel is a meaningless term. It just means you're not dealing with a morchella species, but you can still identify these things. So you can see, I've got 2 different pictures up here, but there's the Gyromitra carolinea, Gyromitra corfii, Gyromitra brunea. These are all edible and delicious mushrooms. The Gyromitra esculenta, those are the ones that have toxins in them, and the toxins are basically it's rocket fuel. It's methyl hydrazine, and so you definitely don't want to be consuming rocket fuel. It's not good for you. So those ones are dangerous. There's a way to prepare them where you can get that out of there, but mostly not worth your time. But this is just to say that one of the things that really bothers me is when people say, "Oh, well, that's a false morel. You can't eat those." It should always come down to IDing a specific species. What is this species I'm looking at? And then you determine edibility from there. Any blanket statement, any statement that's like, well, all ones that stain blue are bad for you, or all of these are like this, all of these are like that, then none of them are true. Literally 0 blanket statements. The only thing that's true is that if you know specifically what species of mushroom that this is, you can determine edibility. That's it. There are no other rules that work across the board.
Very nice. Very nice. It's
Good.
like, I feel like our house is the Supreme Court right now. You hear the flushing in the background. And then quickly we wanted to throw these in because we love mushrooms and we have found all of these things. So I just wanted to share some pictures. Like that coral fungus you're going to see all over Rock Creek Park. Again, they're edible, but they're so small, who really wants to, or they can be really bitter. That one below it is the wood bluet, the infamous wood bluet that can be confused with Cortinarias. Honey fungus, it must be ginormous, this organism in Rock Creek. Gem-studded puffball, as we said, you're gonna have to just start training your eyes, start doing this by looking at the ground and just trying to spot anything. Well, as you're doing that, you're gonna probably see a lot of these guys. They're around. I love these ones the most because you flick them, and they go, like, you just get a puff of spores,
little
black
tiny
spores.
volcano eruption of spores.
It's so cool. It looks like it's on fire. Dryad saddle. I don't know if I've ever even eaten that. I do know it's edible and we found it, but it's never been really palatable for me. But
it's controversial just how delicious these are. There's a lot of people that swear by them. A lot of people they smell like watermelon rind, for sure. It's a very distinctive smell when they're out there.
Okay. We have a comment from Megan. What about turkey tail? I've heard it can be used for medicinal purposes. Not sure if it's culinary, tasty, or edible. Go on.
Just medicinal. The medicinal stuff, the papers that I've read on the medicinal factors of turkey tail and lion's mane and cordyceps and a couple other are tenuous. I don't think there's 100% certainty that there is a lot of benefit to them, but there are a lot of promising studies in mice and stuff like that. So, but turkey tail or Trametes versicolor, there's a great video if you're interested in learning how to identify turkey tail. There is a YouTube channel called Learn Your Land. And actually, the guy is really good at explaining a lot of these different mushrooms and how to identify them, but he's got an excellent video on how to identify turkey tail positively. It is the most common fungus you will run into. It is almost everywhere. It decomposes all kinds of stuff. You can grow them culinarily, or I mean, you can grow them in your house for medicinal value, but no one does because it's so easy to go out into the woods and find pounds and pounds of this stuff.
But you can make, for instance, tea from those. Right?
Yeah, you can make tea, you can make tinctures. Mostly I stay on the edible, gourmet, delicious side of the house. Which is why I like lion's mane, because lion's mane is showing a lot of promise in terms of medicinal value, but also is tasty and delicious and worth your time. So
very good point. So those are a few of our favorites that you can find and eat. So helpful. It's also really, really helpful to know what you should avoid. You want to talk a little bit about, well, you kind of touched on those false morels already.
Right. So false morels, there's one specific kind of false morel that is the one in the bottom right-hand corner here that is Gyromitra esculenta. That's the one that contains methylhydrazine, which is a rocket fuel. Don't want that stuff. To me, they don't look like morels at all. I'm not sure why they got false morels in the first place, but I think it's because they come up around the same time. Actually, the Gyromitras will come up slightly before morels. So a lot of times you'll go out on your first foray of the year trying to find morels and find these guys instead. What else? Maybe the most iconic mushroom of all, the top right, the fly agaric, the Aminata muscaria. Is not deadly toxic, but it's got some toxins in it that will have you have basically a bad trip. Do not recommend using those guys.
Well, unlike the destroying angel.
Yes.
So there are some within that.
And very closely related to the Aminatas in particular, and in fact, just in general, if you find a mushroom in the woods that strongly resembles a white button mushroom like you would buy at the grocery store, there's a high chance that is a toxic mushroom. So be careful of those, especially if you find one you're like, oh, this looks like I could have bought this at the store. Don't touch those ones. Yeah. I mean, you can touch them, but don't expect to be able to bring those home and eat them unless you're very, very advanced and know what you're doing.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to point out, so bullets are very interesting. A bullet, if anybody has had a porcini mushroom before, I think they're called king bullets, are super choice edibles, but and they're kind of unique because they have these pores on the bottom. But in the same vein of that, there are a lot of bullets. They look a lot like a porcini, but they're toxic, or they're just not going to taste very good. So that is part of why we didn't highlight that one here. Is it just takes a little bit of experience to really get into the bullets. I think that's sort of one of our next phases. We haven't explored that much with those.
Absolutely.
Another one quickly here to show you would be the jack-o'-lantern, which we talked about, which is sort of easily confused for things like chanterelle. Is down there. That's that orange one that glows in the dark.
And I have found, by the way, I have found chanterelles and jack-o'-lanterns growing right next to each other in Rock Creek Park. Same time of year, same everything. So the chanterelles grow out of the ground, the jack-o'-lanterns grow out of wood, but that wood could be buried in the ground. So you do want to make sure that you're checking those gills on all your finds.
That's kind of an interesting thing. So for me, I'm a plant scientist, but a phenomena you see a lot in nature, and I see it with fungi as well, is like you will see plants that mimic one another, like wheat and jointed goat grass. One is a weed, one is a plant that's very desirable, but they tend to grow at the same time and next to each other. So nature has a way of doing that, and also with mushrooms.
Yeah, and mostly this list that we're giving you is for your future research, right? Like we said at the beginning, this isn't the end all be all. You're not going to be able to just offhand go pick a bunch of stuff in the woods after this and start eating things. You still have to do the research. So the species that we listed there are ones that you should be aware of and ones you should look up pictures of as you move forward in the hobby.
Yeah. So quickly to talk a little bit about poisoning, because it is very unlikely, but it could happen, and so it's something you always have to be aware of. If you have been poisoned, they're not going to be able to give you a quick fix on that. What you can do is try to get treatment very quickly, and I haven't had it, but sometimes they might induce vomiting or whatever. We do know that the faster you get help, if you really are concerned and you think you have, the faster you get help, the more likely you are to be alive later. Again, as we've said a bunch, so I'm not going to linger, but please don't eat something that does not look right to you, or that you can't ID. And a lot of times things are technically edible, but if they don't smell or look right, just don't touch them. There's like so many out there. It's not worth the time.
Yeah.
You can, the symptoms often resemble those of undercooked mushrooms as well, because they have certain chemical compounds that do get denatured through cooking. So it's very important to cook them. So sometimes it's hard to tell the difference, but poisoning would be like abdominal cramping is a huge one, vomiting, diarrhea. These are very common. If you ever feel nauseous or dizzy, immediately call a medical professional. And then, yeah, I just want to point out, if I were you and I were mushroom hunting or getting into it, memorize that picture right there. That's the death cap. I think it's over 90% of deaths in the US have been caused by the death cap. And it's an especially scary mushroom because of how it works. So basically, you eat it and you're not going to feel anything for like 6 to 24 hours. And then those symptoms above are going to start kicking in and you're going to start feeling those. You're going to go to the hospital. What happens when you're at the hospital is you start to feel better. For whatever reason, they kind of go away and the hospital says, okay, you're fine. I don't want to freak everybody out, but we do sometimes have to throw the scary stories in here. That is when the death cap strikes. Several days later, it has literally disintegrated your liver.
Liquefied.
Yeah, and so that's a terrifying mushroom. Just know the ones that don't have poisonous lookalikes, and then know the key poisonous ones. And you should most likely be absolutely fine getting going on this.
The other piece here, and a lot of this is so let's say you ate something and now you're feeling a little weird and you're in that moment where you're like, okay, do I call 911? Do I go to the hospital right now? Is there something I can do in the meantime to be able to understand what just happened, right? For me, this first group here, there's a poisons help emergency identification for mushrooms and plants. This is helpful if you have a mushroom or if you have a picture of the mushroom that someone has ingested. This could be, a lot of times the posts that I see on this group are about, hey, my dog just ate this mushroom, right? And it was in my backyard. I'm not a mushroom hunter at all. What kind of mushroom is this? Are they going to get sick from it? Or my kids started nibbling on this thing in the backyard. Like, is that a huge problem? Like, what do I, so for those moments of uncertainty, there is a Facebook group that is monitored 24/7. It is the same group that actually, if you took to an emergency room doctors are not experts on mushroom poisoning. And there's a lot of different kinds of poisons and toxins in mushrooms. So identifying the specific toxin can change the treatment that you would do. So a lot of doctors actually have this Facebook group where they will post, hey, I just had a patient in here. This is the mushroom that, like, what is this? What am I dealing with here? So super excellent group to be in there. Do not post regular identifications. There are other forums for regular identifications. The same top tier experts are on both of them. This one's just for emergencies, but it's there if you need it. The other piece is the Poison Control Center. If you've ingested anything weird, they know what to do. And then if there's any time where you are going to call 911, you are going to go in. It's sort of the same as being bitten by a snake. If you have the snake, if you have the mushrooms, or you have other ones that you can take in with you, that's super, super helpful across the board.
Totally. And for those of you who might be politely hanging on, not, being like, hey, when are these long-winded people almost done? We are getting there. We're almost done with this, but I won't blame you. All right. So a couple other notes to share with you that we thought were kind of helpful. So notes on preparation and cooking. One of the biggest questions that comes up is whether or not you should be washing your mushrooms. And my own opinion is you should do what you're most comfortable with. So even though I know that this isn't recommended, I wash all of my mushrooms because a lot of times they're grown in weird substances. But if somebody ever asks, or you want to know, the sort of classic recommendation here is that you should just damply, have a damp cloth and just wash them off, or have a little brush and bristle them off. People feel like washing them in water is going to make them absorb too much or make them soggy. So that's not really recommended. Just brush them off. Couple other interesting things. So with certain mushrooms, and one of them is an inky cap, which are edible, and they grow both in Wyoming and in Maryland. They can make you really sick if you eat them with alcohol. So you might want to look up to make sure when you find a mushroom whether or not it can be combined with alcohol, or if there's any kind of prohibitions there. When you find a wild mushroom, don't ever eat it raw. As I said, there's certain chemical compounds that need to be denatured by heat, or they will make you sick. They won't kill you, but they'll make you sick. As we've said repeatedly, don't eat gross stuff, just in general. But then another note on cooking: when you are cooking them, I tend to like to cook everything low and slow, but with mushrooms you don't want to do that. You're going to dry them out. So do go for hot and high. Bam. What else? Don't salt them too much. Well, actually, a lot of people say salt them at the end because you don't want to pull that water out. Personally, if you wanna know the truth, for me, I really enjoy cooking all sorts of mushrooms in chicken broth. I think that's pretty good. Keeps them moist. And then finally, they do love. Keep in mind, I think we've all cooked mushrooms here, but they do. Some of them, particularly chicken of the woods, love butter and oil. I've gone through a whole stick of butter just trying to cook chicken of the woods. So it gets a little messy.
Yeah, the pan gets dry and you add a little bit more oil, and then it sucks it up, and then you add a little bit more oil. You can go overboard there.
Totally. And then a couple notes on legality. So obviously, it's terrible because I am actually guilty of a lot of these things. And I've never been busted, but you should know what you're doing. And if you ever make a choice not to do what is legal, just know it. Private property, you shouldn't ever remove. That's not legal. Generally in state parks, almost all state parks, mushroom hunting is legal, but sometimes they're going to be special prohibitions. So for instance, at Catoctin Mountain Park, you're only allowed to take up to a half a gallon per day out. How well that is actually monitored and policed is, I would speculate, very little. I've never been approached or asked.
We've never been approached in our 5 years of very intensive mushroom hunting. So
Yeah.
Not saying it's not possible, but
and if you're hunting in Maryland, they actually technically have to post, both for berries. Drew and I do a lot of foraging just in general, but for berries and mushrooms, they actually have to conspicuously post whether or not there are prohibitions on that. So state parks are pretty good. In DC, it's Rock Creek Park. Technically, you're supposed to be an educator or have a special permit, and you can be fined if you're caught. I've never been asked to show a permit, but it's good to know. And then again, like state parks at the federal level, you're usually fine. Here in Wyoming, I think we have to actually purchase a permit.
Oh, yeah, okay. So you're allowed to take 10 pounds per day out of the national forest out here, but you have to get a free permit in order to be able to do that. And with the federal U.S. Forest Service, each forest area is under the control of one person who can make their own separate rules for that area. So make sure there's no blanket, oh, you're allowed to or you're not allowed to in terms of national forests. You have to check each one, and they'll have guidance.
Yeah. Couple other things that you wanted to add.
Critical. So this is mostly, we're going to send around and make sure everybody has a copy of this afterwards. This is mostly for your own research from this point forward, right? So we've given you hopefully the confidence and the permission to go out to find mushrooms, but you're going to want places to look into mushroom identification. So there's a bunch of good Facebook groups on here. The False Morels Demystified is the one who They taught me all about Gyromitras. So if you're interested in that as well, there's also a Boletes of North America group that is specifically for Boletes. And so, but if you post to the general Mushroom ID group and they're not 100% sure there, they might point you to one of these more specific groups in order to get an ID. The Reddit mycology subreddit is still pretty good. I prefer the Facebook groups myself, but it's pretty decent. And then there are a couple of online guides and keys that are helpful, like AmericanMushrooms.com. I see now I'm missing one that I like called MushroomExpert.com. Mushroom Expert, super sciencey guy, lots of details you won't need, but pretty much any mushroom you can imagine, he's got a detailed page on that mushroom specifically. So I'll add that to this slide before we go. And then mycological associations and societies. So there's a Washington, D.C., Mycological Association of Washington, D.C., and then there's a North American Mycological Association. Both of those run forays, which if you're not confident learning all this stuff yourself, a foray might be a nice starter where you can go out with mushroom experts, find a bunch of stuff, and then they will be able to identify it for you and let you know where to look and things like that.
Yeah. So here's what I propose we do. So this has been the bulk of our presentation. What I think I'd like to do, we have a kind of a little exercise for those who want to stick around, and it's sort of about observing different, it's brief, but about observing different kind of characteristics of mushrooms. But let me say goodbye before we do that, and then I'm going to put anybody who would like to stick around back on video because there's not too many people here. If you are ready to get going, we just wanted to say thank you very much for your time and for zooming in. Our email addresses, I think, are at the beginning of this presentation. Please feel free at any point if you have questions or you'd like a copy that somehow you don't get it. Reach out to either of us. We're happy to field any questions. Anything to add, Drew?
Just if you want to learn how to grow them yourself, I've got that course coming out next week on Thursday. Yeah. So it's another one of these series. I'm sure if you found this one, you can find that one as well. But
cool. Oh, thank you, Jessica.
Yeah, and then do we have to hit something to let people go back on video?
Let's see, there we go. I have to talk, and then we can field questions as well. I am not sure how we get people to go back on video.
No participants.
Yes, okay, we have a question though. I have a giant fallen locust in my backyard. That's a type of tree. Can I grow mushrooms on it? Bye, Mel, thank you.
Yes, short answer is yes. Locust, I think oyster mushrooms will grow on locust. There's a couple of websites that I can send you. Actually, if you come to my class next week, I can give you a couple websites, or you can shoot me an email. They give you a list of what mushrooms like which trees. But I'm pretty sure locusts are hardwoods, and mushrooms like hardwoods in general. What you want to do is plug the log. So if you have a big tree or a big chunk of a tree, you can get these little myceliated dowels of oyster mushrooms or of a couple other places, and you basically drill holes, shove the dowels in, and then cover it with a little bit of wax in order to keep the moisture in. But yes, absolutely, that's totally viable. I know good ones for logs just in general on hardwoods are oysters, shiitakes, lion's mane, maitake. Yeah, that's pretty much the good ones that would grow.
I would start with oysters.
I would start with oysters.
If I were Jessica, or yeah.
Oysters are very vigorous and they love eating stuff. And if you give them a decent head start, they'll definitely take over and bloom for years and years and years. Actually, yeah. They say generally the diameter of the log that you plug, you'll get 1 year of flushes for each inch. So if you have a 6-inch diameter log, that's 6 years of flushes. If you have a 24-inch giant base of a tree, it could just keep cranking for a really, really long time.
Thanks, Taney. Any other questions? Actually, before we
awesome.
Yay! We don't know how to take you guys off video, or like you're welcome to unmute yourself. If you want to stick around, we did have a couple of just a quick. What do you notice? We put this together.
This is mostly just for training your eyes, right? These are all pictures of various fungi that we have seen in the woods, mostly around Rock Creek and in Maryland. Oh, nice, James there. And we just wanted to know, you can type in there, or you're welcome to unmute yourself.
You can unmute if you like.
What do you guys see? What kind of features are you noticing on these? And we've got a handful of different slides here. Anything stand out to you?
I think we basically took all of these guys while we were in Rock Creek.
See wood ear.
Actually, good guess.
Close.
So close. This is where it's tricky. Okay, so I think you're referring to the brown one there, and it looks so much like wood ear. It's the one thing it could be easy. That's very good. It could be easily confused with, and it's basically brown jelly fungus.
Yeah, it's called, the common name is brown jelly fungus. It's Exoda ricisa. Also not toxic, although the texture is not as good as wood ears. So
Yeah.
edible.
Yep.
And some of these are, so some of these are tricks. So the two on the left, the red one and the yellow one, are actually not fungi, which is unfortunate. It's a lot of the stuff you see out there, you're like, oh, this must be a fungus. But when they kind of look like caviar a little bit, it's actually most likely a slime mold, which is a whole set of things. So the red and yellow there are slime molds.
And is the dumpling in the top right, is that cauliflower?
No, close. And a lot of these, it's tough to tell with scale on these pictures. So that one is probably about an inch wide. It is another kind of jelly fungus. It's a white jelly fungus, but it looks like cauliflower.
It does. That was
It's in that
good.
ballpark, yeah.
That's more translucent though, I see.
Yeah, but
it's kind of got that clear quality to it, yeah.
I think that so a lot of this hobby is it's not just about eating these things. It's really, like, as I said, I took all these photos. It's all about taking the pictures.
There's such cool stuff out there. Like, if you wander around enough, you will see these red caviar looking things sitting on the log, and you're like, what even is this?
Once you start, you can't stop either. It's a little addictive. So here was another one.
So to who says, so Salam, you said wood ear in that last picture. This one, the top left log here, has both a jelly fungus, that is the brown jelly fungus, Exoda ricisa, and then over on the other side of the log, you can see some wood ear popping out. So you can actually have multiple different kinds of fungus on the same log. All of this is edible, but you can see the ones that look a little bit more like ears up in that corner are the wood ears there.
Mm-hmm. Tell us what down there, Drew. I think that was a fairy ring in the bottom left.
Yeah, so the fairy ring, this picture specifically was in here so that people could see what a ring looks like around that stipe, around that stem. The ring is really important, and you can also see from this level that there are more features than you would ever see looking straight down on it. So sometimes it's helpful to bend down a little bit or look a little bit further away so that you can see features. Or if you're taking pictures of things, this kind of thing is critical. For an ID online. That little ring around there makes a huge difference as to whether this is an agaricus or whether this is a common field mushroom. There's a bunch of different options there.
Yeah. What else we got here? What did you think? Oh,
yeah. Yes. Anybody recognize any of these? Anybody seen any of these out in the woods before?
Yeah, some of these should be like very familiar. There's something kind of tricksy. Do you guys, anybody have any idea? Never, says Lou.
So you can see, well, this is, so Lou, yeah, this is critical. One of the things that helps you recognize mushrooms is going out and seeing a lot of mushrooms. You know, we've seen a million of each of these at this point now, so it feels very common to us, but to someone new, like, oh man, okay, so that one's got a really, really long stem, and it's got kind of scales on the cap. Ghost pipe. Excellent.
Yes.
Megan nailed it. So that one is not a mushroom. We see these all the time out there. Ghost pipe, Indian pipe. It's actually a parasite, I think.
A parasitic plant.
Parasitic
but it can't
plant.
photosynthesize by
It doesn't
itself.
photosynthesize, but once you get out there and you start hunting mushrooms, you'll come across a lot of things like slime molds and these Indian pipes, and there's something called bear squaw or cancer root that comes up and looks like, oh man, you really want it to be a morel, because it comes up in the right season and it looks kind of like a morel, and it will just fool you every time.
Oh yeah.
Or the number of pine cones that I have thought were a morel that just turned out to be a pine cone. It's so frustrating.
What else? Oh, we wanted to kind of point this one out. Oh my gosh, these are so cool. The variety in this kingdom is like blows my mind. So up in that top right hand corner is what kind is that?
Lactarius.
Lactarius, but it bleeds like a latex sticky substance, which is so cool. There's a lot of them that do. Most of them are edible when you find a
Yeah.
mushroom that bleeds latex like that. The ones in the bottom, this is one of my all-time favorite photos. It's like a bird, what do we call it?
Bird's nest fungus.
Bird's nest. This is itty bitty tiny. It's just beautiful. Yeah. And I think, was there anything you wanted to know or ask about this other
Oh,
one?
just this, yeah, the Lactaris ones, the ones with a little bit of goo coming out. That's sort of a feature we didn't really talk about, but some of them bleed and some of them change colors as you go. And the bleeding ones, actually a lot of the bleeding ones are edible. There's one called the indigo milky cap. It bleeds bright blue and looks like it's going to kill you and is actually delicious. So you can't judge a book by its cover. That's the whole thing about not having any hard and fast rules. Like there are some that stain blue that are really toxic, and then there's this indigo milky cap that is bluer than you would possibly imagine. It's bluer than a blueberry, but is apparently delicious. We haven't found those yet, but
Last set of pictures here. Did I miss it? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. So some fun things. So, okay, down in that bottom right or bottom left corner, that is the wood bluet, another version of the wood bluet that we were talking about. That's terrifying and delicious at the same time. Kind of, what do we call these? Is a sort of a special kind of gill, that one that kind of looks like a sun.
it's a polypore, but it is called the it's like the polygon polypore or something like that, where they look like little hexagons in the pores themselves. And so, yeah, this was to illustrate the difference between the really, really closely spaced pores of this red and yellow bolete.
That's on the left top.
Yeah, that's on the top left with that bulbous stem on it. And then this other polypore, which is just a very different kind of polypore. It's not quite gills, it's not quite, you know, some pore surface, but it is a polypore technically. And then both of these are polypores with stems that grow out of the ground. Versus most of the polypores we've talked about so far, chicken of the woods, black standing polypore, Berkeley's polypore, grow off wood, and they don't have stems. They connect directly to the wood. So it's just a fun little distinction there.
Lou says, I had something similar. This is not the bird. I had something similar to the bird's nest growing in my garden. And it looked like a
yeah, actually, I think the ones that we had there were a picture that we took when it was on we did straw bale gardening.
Oh, I remember now.
We had a garden with a little bit of soil in it, but it was inside these straw bales. And as those broke down, you saw a whole bunch of different kinds of fungus pop out.
Yeah.
They're the breaker downers. That's their job in nature.
So anyhow, that brings us to the end. For those of you who stuck around, thank you so much. Are there any questions or comments? Thank you, Megan.
Thank you, Megan.
This was awesome.
Oh, I'm so glad you
Good.
liked it,
I'm
Jamie.
so glad.
Cool. Thank you so much for joining, you guys. And very good luck. This is a super fun and engaging hobby. Like, just get you out in nature, especially when we're stuck self-isolating.
Yeah.
It's been really nice.
It's really easy to social distance when you're in places in the woods that no one else goes. So, great hobby to get into right now in this little period.
Good luck on your move back east.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much. We really appreciate it.
Have a great evening.
Enjoy. All right.
Bye, Lou.
Got it here. Stop share.